dark journey of Jeffrey Dahmer, the terrible crimes he committed and how he died. When one turns his back on God, there's no limit to what one can do. And sometimes we have a hard time adjusting to that or recognizing that as well. And then last time we talked about the Christianity of Jeff and the fact that he actually had a faith in God, and that Christianity had a big effect upon him. What I want to talk about now is the death of Jeffrey Dahmer and the memorial service that we had for him there, and then the reactions that many people have had to the Jeffrey Dahmer story over the years, and how I react to it and how others have reacted to it as well. As I mentioned, I was studying with Jeff on a regular basis. Every Wednesday was our day to study. And the last time I saw him was the day before Thanksgiving in 1994. And Jeff was so appreciative of me that he actually gave me a card. And it's one of the things over here, a Thanksgiving Day card where he'd signed it and appreciated so much all that I had done. And after his murder, this card appeared in People magazine with me showing a picture of it and so forth, and for them to see it. And it got a little bit of attention in that sense there, but that was the last time I saw Jeff had given me this card, and he's so much appreciated. We were working our way through the book of Revelation at that time. We'd gotten up to about chapter 9, and this was an answer to the questions that he had about what does the book of Revelation mean. And he had a hard time understanding that I had a completely different view of Revelation. I pretty much feel that Revelation is not describing our future at all, but rather it's describing mostly our past. It describes the future of the people who first received the book and gives them tools by which they were going to have to face evil and handle evil and the evil society in which they live. And we learn from that the principles of how to deal with evil in our own society as well. An important verse to me has always been Romans 12 and verse 21. And I remember the verse because the numbers are a palindrome. That is, the numbers go in 1, 2, and then they come out 2, 1. So it's easy to remember that numbers. And it was a verse that was important to me as I was raising my son, because my son had a hard time struggling with evil. And so I tried to drill this scripture into his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And there's a principle there that I think the book of Revelation addresses as well. Because in the book of Revelation you have a great deal of evil that is present. And evil is sometimes symbolized or represented by terrible beasts and things that are frightening to you. It's very hard to sometimes understand it. And yet in the process of looking at it, you find out that evil will always be defeated. Evil will always be destroyed. And so those are some of the principles that I was trying to talk with him and teach him about quite a bit. And I think on that last day that we studied, we were dealing with, I believe it's in chapter 9, which talks about these terrible beasts coming out of the abyss that look like locusts, and they had these iron iron breastplates on and so forth. And I was making the point to him then that evil often carries with it a great deal of armor that protects it from injury. And so it's very hard sometimes, and sometimes we get very frustrated trying to overcome evil. And I alluded to his story as well. There's one story in the story of Jeffrey Dahmer where a young Asian boy was drugged, and he tried to lobotomize the boy, and the boy had escaped and was running around nude. And Milwaukee had a great deal of anger over the fact that 2 police officers had this young naked boy in their custody, and then Jeffrey Dahmer came up and explained to them that they were homosexual lovers, and they had a spat, and he's all right, and he was going to take him back under his wings. And the officers had no recourse but to let him go. The Milwaukee public feeling was angry against these officers. You had this, and you didn't do anything about it. And yet at the same time, and I pointed this out to Jeff, you were taking advantage of your iron breastplate. You were saying to them basically, you can't touch me, because we're just simply homosexual lovers, and we had a spat, and we're taking care of this as best we can, and you can't arrest me because we're being homosexuals. You can't arrest me for that. You can't arrest this guy for running around nude and so forth. He's just dazed right now. We'll take him back. Of course, they would learn later on that he took the boy back and he ultimately killed the boy, is what happened. But I was explaining to him, you took advantage of the iron breastplates to protect yourself, even though you knew what you were doing was wrong. And he had to admit that I understood that I was addressing what he was talking about. But Jeff was growing, and he was changing, and was developing, and growing into a real Christian. And I saw tremendous opportunities there. And then on November the 28th, it was the Monday after Thanksgiving. And I remember hearing about it because I'd gone to the grocery store with my wife. And a news flash came on that Jeffrey Dahmer was taken to the hospital with serious head trauma. And I was shocked to hear that. What head trauma? Did he fall off his bed? What are you talking about? Did he walk into a wall? What kind of head trauma? And then it came on a few minutes later, Jeffrey Dahmer has died. And I had a very hard time understanding that or believing that. And the reason I had a hard time understanding that or believing that was because one of the nemesis of Jeffrey Dahmer was the lawyer for the victims. And the lawyer for the victims was always hounding Jeffrey during the course of his stay in prison. He had had his 25-cent stipend frozen that he earned, 25 cents an hour that he earned for doing his work there, in order that the victims' families could profit from the 25 cents an hour. And Jeff was quite angry about that, because it prevented him from buying stamps to send letters, it prevented him from buying coffee, and it prevented him from buying cigarettes. He liked to smoke at that time too, and so it kept him out of the basic luxuries, or not luxuries, but the basic things that made his life a little bit easier. He wanted to do something for the victims, but that wasn't going to do the thing. The victim's lawyer had also approached Jeff about drawings he had done, and he wanted Jeff to do a lot more drawings, to sell these drawings so he could raise money for the victims' families, and Jeff was insulted by that as well. And so I'd heard a couple of these stories beforehand where they'd gotten some of the stories a little off or hadn't quite got it right, so I thought, well, they must have this story wrong too. But by the time I'd gotten home, the phone was ringing off the wall again, and the media was coming after me, and I didn't want them coming to my house. So I agreed to meet them at the church building, and the picture of me holding up the picture of his card was taken that day. They'd come up from Chicago, and they had interviewed me for People magazine on that day, and they interviewed me for, I think it was hard copy and special edition and various other things that were, I was part of the news that day dealing with Jeffrey Dahmer. And then I started getting phone calls from women to whom he'd been writing letters to, who they thought they were in love with him, and he'd written them sweet letters and so forth. And as I read the letters, I could see where they would think that he was stating love to them, but at the same time I could also interpret it as a Christian love, just reaching out to people who were showing kindness to him as well. So it was hard for me sometimes to interpret what was going on, but it was very difficult the first couple of days there, because I didn't have the opportunity to grieve myself for Jeffrey Dahmer, who had at this time become my friend. It's hard to understand how he could become my friend. I remember a comedian, I think it's Bill Maher, Bill Maher, had made a joke about, friends don't let friends eat friends, playing with that whole thing. And I remember thinking, well, you've just completely taken it out of context. You can't even comprehend that when you sit down across from someone an hour a week for 6 months, and you open your heart to them, and they open their heart to you, and you begin to look into their heart, and you begin to see that the man is straining and trying to become, as much as God would let him become, a different person and a new person, that eventually you begin to like that person, and that person begins to like you, and you develop a friendship. And so we were able to sometimes share with things. I alluded earlier to struggles I'd had with the question of suicide, and he was able to identify with me on that, and we were able to talk quite a bit about some of the lessons we had learned. One of the lessons being that when you're in that state of mind, you're not in your right state of mind. You're not thinking clearly. You're thinking only about the pain and how you can avoid the pain. You're not really thinking about how is what I'm contemplating going to affect other people. How is what I'm contemplating going to solve anything at all? How am I teaching my children or people who look up to me how to solve their problems other than to run away from them in this sort of way? And so there was an awful lot of things that we had talked about, and we sort of bonded together in that sense. So yes, I'm not ashamed to admit that he'd become my friend. And I felt like I was his friend. And so when he gave me this card before he died, it was a true expression of friendship on his part for me, true expression of gratitude. For him, the holiday meant a great deal because he was truly thankful that I had come into his life. And so I heard now about how he was murdered. And of course, eventually the stories would come out as to how it happened. Christopher Scarver was the man who had done it. They were three of them working on cleaning a bathroom detail. Christopher Scarver was the kind of man who had a hair trigger anger problem. And so there was some question as to why Christopher Scarver did it. And no one really knew the answer. No one had a good answer for why he did it. He had killed not only Jeffrey, but he had also killed another man named Jesse Anderson. Jesse Anderson was killed, it was theorized again, because he had killed his wife and had blamed two black men for doing it. And so some noted that Christopher Scarver himself was black, and that Jesse Anderson had blamed black people for killing his wife, and that some of Jeff's victims were black, not all of them. As I pointed out, some of them were white, some were Native American, some were Asian, some were Hispanic. Jeff had kind of a rainbow of people that he killed. So you can't say Jeff killed out of a sense of racial hatred, but some attached to Christopher Scarver a sense of racial hatred. He killed Jeff for killing black people. That's what some people heard. Later on, people speculated, well, maybe he was paid to do it. Maybe someone had offered him to do this and so forth. And that idea became more clear when they began to explore and look into the guards who were supposed to be watching over Jeff. There were 2 guards assigned to them. One had gone off to make a phone call. Another was listening to some music and really wasn't paying attention, and allowed Christopher Scarver to go to a weight machine and remove from the weight machine a piece of metal weight that you use to make the weights heavier and stronger, had snuck up behind Jeff as he was cleaning the toilet and bashed him in the side of the head until his face caved in. And then had sought out Jesse Anderson and had killed him as well. I got a call not long after that from Lionel Dahmer. I had received a letter from Lionel when I was at camp during Jeff's life. Lionel was worried that I was going to give up on Jeff, and so had written me a letter saying, please don't give up on my son, he still needs you. And I'd written him back and said, I'm committed to serving your son for the rest of my life. You don't need to worry about that, sir. And that was the only conversation only contact I'd had with him. And now here was he in the flesh. He was in a hotel in Madison. Would I please come down and talk to him? And so I came down to the hotel and met him and his wife there. And we spent 3 hours talking together. He wanted me to perform a memorial service for Jeff. And he talked quite a bit about having to identify Jeff's body and the pain that he felt in going down there and seeing the head beaten in so badly and so forth, and identifying Jeff. And he was also touched by the fact that Jeff was handcuffed at this point. He's dead, and yet he's handcuffed, and he took a great deal of misery in that. And I mentioned that some time ago to what I thought was a ridiculous thing, and was told by another prison guard that, no, it's a prison policy that any time a prisoner leaves prison, they must be handcuffed, regardless of the condition that they're in. And that seems silly to us, but it's a true policy that they live by. So they had him handcuffed so that he wouldn't do anything, even though he was a dead person at the time. But it gave a certain amount of grief to Lionel to see his son lying there with his head obviously caved in. The young boy was dead, and that was his son. And so we spent some time talking together, and I was able to talk to Lionel in a way that I had wished that Jeff could have talked to him about. I spoke to him about the question Jeff has to why they quit going to church. And Lionel explained to me that his wife had what he thought was a bipolar condition. He's not certain of that. He's not a doctor, but that's just kind of what he felt that she was suffering from. And that she gradually degenerated with that as the years went by. And that she had taken some drugs, according to the book that he wrote here. He suggests that she was taking drugs when she was carrying Jeff, and that maybe the drugs had had a bad effect on Jeff. And this is what caused a bitter fight later on after Jeff's death over the brain of Jeffrey Dahmer, which I'll get to in a few moments here. But the mother was combating the charge that somehow the drugs she had taken while she carried Jeff in her womb had altered his brain, and that was why Jeff had done these things. And the father had seemed to suggest that in his book, and she was countering that that's not the case at all, and it just simply wasn't true. And so they were fighting back and forth about this and so forth. But he had explained to me that their relationship had deteriorated. He explained to me that when he first married her, that she was a member of the church, he wasn't. But that he had started going to church with her and was eventually converted himself and became a part of the church as well. And that later on, then, as her condition deteriorated, she quit going to church. He didn't want to go to church, but he kept coming. He kept coming and bringing Jeff by himself. All they had was just Jeff and him is all they had. And that the last time he went, he said it was a still memorable thing in his mind, that there had been such a horrible argument that she felt guilt being posed upon her because he was going to church with Jeff and leaving her at home alone. And that they had a horrible argument. And the argument was so bad that Lionel decided, well, I'm not going to go there any longer. So he decided, I'll just stay home. I'll eat my crackers and drink my juice at home. And I'll study the Bible at home. And that's how I'll handle my church service. And that's what he did. And I told him, Jeff always wondered why you quit going to church. And he never knew. And Lionel kind of shook his head and felt like, we should have talked about that. But we never did. That's one of those things that a parent and child should talk about. But they never got around to talking about that. And I felt kind of bad that here I am, the one finally getting answers to questions that Jeff longed to know, hungered to hear about, but just didn't understand at all. And then there was a question about how did he come about to send this material to Jeff, because Jeff had accredited him with the beginning of his odyssey of faith. And Lionel was shocked about that. He didn't know that. And so then he fills me in on the story about how his son David had gone to the University of Ohio and had got connected up with a Bible chair there, had converted to Christianity, and then had come home and told his dad, please go back to church. And then when he went back to church, there was a seminar they were doing on evolution, and how he scooped this material and sent it to Jeff, and that Jeff and he had debates over these sorts of things for a period of time. And then when they got together, they enjoyed talking and theorizing and dealing with these sorts of things like that. But he didn't know that Jeff credited this material with what had changed his mind about God. So Lionel was quite shocked about that. And that's another little conversation that I felt should have been exchanged between father and son. And that, unfortunately, I was the one to have to deal with this. It was an honor to some degree to tell Lionel that Jeffrey credited him with bringing about his faith. But Lionel never knew that. He had no idea. So again, you had another time when father and son, when they came together, they talked about things, but they never talked about the things that were important to them when they got together. He started talking about the memorial service, and they wanted me to pick out no more than 5 or 6 couples within the congregation to come to the memorial service. He wanted me to pick people who could keep their mouths shut. He didn't want anyone to be able to talk about it. He wanted me to use my best judgment. And I tried to obey his orders, and that caused some problems for me in the congregation. Because there were people who felt like they should have been invited. And they're quite angry that they weren't invited. And they weren't invited because I judged them having big mouths. They like to drop names. I was at Jeffrey Dahmer's funeral. I got to be there. That was the kind of thing. But why did he not want publication? Because his son David was going to be there. His other son David had changed his last name legally, so that no one would know he was related to Jeffrey Dahmer. And he was going to come under the condition that no one would take his photograph and no one would take a picture of him. They would have 2 TV crews there. One from Ohio and one from Milwaukee. I was not to inform the local news agencies that Jeff was there. That got me in trouble with them too, because they felt that they were my friends now, and that I would tell them as soon as these things sort of happened. And I had to explain to them when they called me up and felt like you had betrayed us. You said you would tell us, and you didn't tell us. Well, I was not allowed to. That's what the Dahmer family requested. And so we scheduled the time for the memorial service, and I had some of our members, one of our members leading songs, and it was a short, not terribly short, but it was a time to come together. And Lionel was worried about his son David coming in, and so he had made arrangements he wanted me to make arrangements for David to stay with someone, so I'd gone to the trouble of finding someone who would give him a place to stay. And when David arrived, then David had other plans in mind. David didn't want to stay in the arrangements that his father had made up. He wanted to stay in the motel instead. And it was kind of an awkward thing, and all Lionel could say to me when David came on the scene is, well, there are issues between father and son that we still haven't worked out yet. This is not the ideal family. It's a family like so many other families. There had been divorce, there had been bitterness. David had gone to live with mother, who did everything in her power to influence young David against father. So there were issues between son and father at this point in time. And this is the younger brother of the infamous Jeffrey Dahmer. So we began having